Cast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, thank you for joining us today and welcome to the next of ESHA Research's webinars. Today we're going to look at working with recipes in Genesis R&D food. A little background, as we always do in these webinars, ESHA Research was established in 1981 as one of the very first nutrition software solutions. Today we have a number of solutions including Genesis R&D Food, Genesis R&D Supplements, Food Processor, Consulting Services, and Database licensing. As I mentioned, we're going to be looking at the Genesis R&D Food application today. It was released in 1991 and is designed for product development, formula analysis, menu analysis, reporting, and regulatory compliance and labeling. We do have a few upcoming webinars. Next week, we're going to have a webinar going through the Genesis R&D Supplements software. So that is a separate software from the one we're going to be looking at today. It is designed for dietary supplements. It's going to be kind of a 101 course, just an introductory going over kind of the basics of the program. So if you do any supplement formulation, you don't have the supplements program, you could join in there, take a look and see what the program is all about, and see if it would be something that would be useful for you, and then you could contact our sales team if it's something you'd want to look into. And then after that one, we're going to have a using recipe yields and moisture adjustments on May 14th. And then a review of the 2016 nutrition labeling guidelines on July 17th. So looking at those new laws, all the things that have changed since they were initially released in 2016 and all that stuff with added sugars, potassium, everything else. Please note, as always, this webinar is being recorded. A recording will be available on our website and emailed to everyone that registered for the webinar. Every other webinar past is going to be available on our website, and you can sign up for those future ones on the website as well. And you do have that question panel that you have available in this webinar today. Feel free to ask questions along the way. Don't wait till the end once she's finished everything up. Ask questions along the way, and we've got people standing by to answer those questions. And today what we're going to cover: entering recipes in Genesis, setting serving sizes in RACCs, standardizing your label, and then best reports for documentation, and a few questions and answers. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Alicia, and she's going to walk us through our webinar today.
Thank you, Ben. As always, thanks for being here. So one of the primary functions of Genesis R&D is recipe analysis, and I'll discuss some of the key points in entering and working with recipes in Genesis, and then we'll jump into the software to show you where to find those. And just a reminder that webinar formats like this provide an overview of ideas and features, but we also offer full hands-on Genesis R&D training sessions that cover much more detail and give you opportunity to work through your specific examples. We'll provide the training schedule towards the end of the webinar, and you can always find details on upcoming classes on the ESHA website. In working with Genesis, the basic steps that you will build recipes from ingredients in the software. You'll set a serving size for the recipe so that Genesis calculates the nutrient content appropriately, and then you can view the analysis from various reports available in Genesis. That includes the nutrition facts label formats and many other reports. With Genesis, the end goal might often be creating the nutrition facts label. So you can build recipes from the ESHA database items that ship with Genesis, or you can add as many new ingredients as you need from your supplier information. And we have a whole webinar that covers adding new ingredients and more of the settings that apply to both ingredients and recipes, like units of measure, cost, notes, and so much more. Naming conventions and searching in recipes also piggybacks off of ideas presented in that ingredients webinar. So I encourage you to check out that webinar if you haven't already, and we'll include a link for you in the follow-up to today's webinar. We also have archived webinars dedicated to creating labels and working with ingredient and allergen statements, so please refer to those for more of the regulatory-related topics. With recipe analysis in Genesis, you want to select ingredients that most accurately represent the foods you're working with. You also want to consider the steps and processes along the way to fine-tune your analyses as much as possible. Some processes like moisture loss from cooking or drying, storage conditions, ingredients added on preparation surfaces or production lines, frying oil, or any other ingredients used along the way can affect the finished product's content. In Genesis, you can work with the serving size in a few different ways. The serving size options in the software are a recipe makes so many servings, or a serving weighs a certain weight and unit. And you can choose either of these based on what you know. You can enter a batch size in any amount. So it might be a large batch in thousands of pounds, or just the amounts of ingredients to make one serving. I know folks do this either way. You can also enter your formula by percent. And to do that, you might use 100 grams or a consistent unit like grams, pounds, ounces to represent 100%. So you enter your ingredients in grams corresponding to the percent of the formula, and your total batch size should equal 100 grams or 100% when you've entered all your ingredients. In determining the serving size, I want to mention the RACC here, or the reference amounts customarily consumed. This is the section of the U.S. regulations used to determine serving sizes for labeling, and the RACC was updated with the 2016 labeling regulations. So be aware of changes to some of these product categories if you're working with some of those that changed with the 2016 rules. You'll see on this slide an example page from the RACC. For labeling, you use this table to find the product category that your food best fits and refer to the RACC amount listed in the table. So that middle column, the reference amount, is going to drive maybe your target, what you're aiming for. Of course, this all depends on portion sizes. If you portion your foods in a specific unit size, it can certainly differ from that reference amount. And the reference amount is the standard FDA determined serving size. It's not a recommended amount of what consumers should eat, but rather a determination of the amount of each food type that Americans typically consume. It's used for consistency in labeling. The labeling or the label statement column in this table indicates household measures that are used when expressing the serving size on the label. And again, sometimes your serving size matches that reference amount exactly. Sometimes it might be larger or smaller. And so just be aware that it's at least a reference when you're working with particular foods. And just a note on this, determining and declaring serving sizes, again, is covered in great detail in our Genesis R&D training classes. So you can learn so much more and work with your specific examples in our training classes. I want to provide this other reference for you concerning the RACC. In February 2018, the FDA provided additional guidance on the RACC, and this guidance provides more examples for the product categories. So if you refer to the RACC and you can't find your product, or you're not quite sure which one yours fits into, you might be able to find clarification within this document. I mentioned earlier that you want to consider all processes and ingredients that affect the content of the finished product. Genesis includes features and fields that allow you to apply adjustments to the analysis to best represent your finished foods. The Edit Yields feature includes a moisture adjustment, and it's probably the most commonly used adjustment feature. We get a lot of questions on it, and we know that that one is heavily used. It can be applied to account to moisture loss in baking, reduction of sauces, or other drying or evaporation steps. And Genesis allows you to remove some of the moisture content from your recipe. And I'll show you this in the software in just a few moments. And we will also have a separate webinar that dives into this topic in more detail. That's coming up. Another way to address adjustments in your formula is with the nutrient override fields in the Edit Recipe features. This might be used if you have lab data that you wish to report rather than the calculated database data, or say you know a certain % loss occurs to vitamins during processing. You can factor those changes in and enter override values into Genesis directly. Once you've entered your ingredients into your recipe, Genesis calculates the nutritional content per the serving that you've set. We also have the nutrient calculator tool that can be used to fill in additional nutrient fields based on those already reported. This can be helpful in converting units that were used, for instance, in previous regulations to new required units. A lot of our nutrient units changed from the 1990 to 2016 US labels, so this can help convert those nutrients for you. For some nutrients like vitamin D, the conversion from IU to micrograms is a straight conversion, so that just populates from one field to another. For other nutrients like vitamins A and E, you may be prompted for source details. So Genesis may ask you, is this a plant or animal, or is this a natural or synthetic form of the nutrient? And you choose the form or the formula that applies, and Genesis will calculate the appropriate conversion. After entering your recipes, it's good practice to use the Check Data tool in the Edit Recipe Features Nutrients tab. When you click on the Check Data button, you'll see the Check Data screen, which includes a set of calculations being run to essentially review your work for you. Check Data identifies some points that you might want to review or even modify. And the default tolerance level you can see here is set at 5%. You can adjust that as needed. Check Data runs calculations on the estimated or calculated values and compares those with the actual values that were entered. For instance, for calories, calories uses the estimated or the calculates 449 calories using 4 grams of protein, 4 grams of carbs, 4 calories for each of those, factors in 9 calories for each gram of fat, adds those together to come up with a comparison to the calories entered, that is the calories added up for each ingredient. So Genesis approaches those in a couple different ways, 2 different methods, and sometimes those numbers don't match. That's okay. What you do want to look for is how far off. If they don't match, how far off are they? And then go back to your protein, carbs, fat, the calories that have been entered, make sure that everything has been entered correctly from supplier spec sheets and other sources. And you'll see here the Check Data is also running calculations on fat. So comparing a calculated fat value versus the total fat that's reported and its components. There's also Check Data on the weights components, so we refer to those as the approximates: protein, carbs, fat, ash, water, alcohol, checking to see if those numbers add up, and then there's a section on carbohydrates. So remember that this Check Data is intended to give you feedback. It's not necessarily compliance or non-compliance indicator, but it rather points out values that you may want to review and just make sure that your values make sense within the tolerance that is set or that you set. You may have heard this before, but I encourage you to review the spreadsheet report for your recipes. The spreadsheet lists each ingredient and its nutritional content. And the spreadsheet also indicates missing values with dashes. This tells you where you need to review ingredient records and fill in the blanks to report complete and accurate information. You can see in this example that 2 of the ingredients are missing dietary fiber 2016 values, and we need that information for labeling purposes. So especially those mandatory label nutrients, you want to make sure that those are all completely filled in with no dashes, as well as any voluntary nutrients you're reporting or any nutrients that are of concern to you and you're sharing information with others. If you do see dashes on the spreadsheet, you want to fill in the blanks. To fill in the blanks, you would open the ingredient record. So here, for instance, the flour, the gluten-free flour, go back to the ingredient record for the gluten-free flour and fill in the fiber data for that item it will carry forward, populate in the recipe, as well as the label that is created from that recipe. Genesis includes several predetermined nutrient sets found in the Nutrients to View settings. These are the nutrients that you see on screen when you're working with ingredients and recipes, as well as on reports. The Nutrients to View, however, doesn't determine the nutrients that you see on the label. Those are selected through the Edit Label features. When you click on the Nutrients to View button, you see all of the nutrient sets available in Genesis, as well as a check mark next to the set that you have selected at that time. The default set in Genesis is about 60 nutrients. We also have labeling related sets of nutrients, and you can click back and forth between those at any time. Change the view that you want to see on reports or on the screen you're working with. You can also create new customized sets of nutrients to view. An example of that might be creating the US 2016 label set with the addition of water. Or if you commonly work with fortified cereal products, you might create a set that includes the label nutrients with the additional vitamins and minerals that are present in those fortifications, so you know that you're reporting all correctly. In Genesis, we use groups as the term to categorize records. ESHA software includes a list of groups including characteristics, databases, and food types, and you can assign ingredients and recipes to these groups to help filter searches. You can assign a recipe to multiple groups, and you can also create your own groups to help you manage your records, like with versions of your recipes as they make their way through the stages of development. And we have a full webinar that discusses groups as a way to organize your files. So if that is of interest, then check out that webinar. After you have entered your recipe, you want to store some form of your final version for record keeping. And this is especially important with the recipes used for labeling. There are a variety of reports available in Genesis, and you may find that some meet your preferences best. You can save a record as a PDF in Genesis to create that snapshot in time. And as an example, you might save the recipe, the spreadsheet that gives you the nutrient detail for your label nutrients, as well as any other nutrients you want to see, and a snapshot or a PDF of the label itself under the View Label screen. You can save as a PDF because when you open a recipe in Genesis, the data is live. So if you've updated an ingredient or used ESHA database items and a software update has occurred, the recipe analysis and even labels can change. So it's important to capture that date-stamped record of your label and the supporting values in a form that won't change, like a PDF. And again, you can use the groups feature to help you save and sort final versions of your recipe so you know which was the one that was used for your label data. And one last item I want to mention before jumping into the program is the Audit Trail feature. The Audit Trail can be enabled so that when a record is saved, a date stamp is added and user information is logged. And you'll see a comment field so you can enter notes on specific changes that were made or any other information that you need to track as part of your record keeping. The recipe features includes notes fields that you could also use to log notes and manually record this type of information, but the Audit Trail automates the process a bit more, and it encourages the habit of documenting. This is especially helpful if you have several people working with the same file and you want to know what changes were made, when, and by whom. And by default, the Audit Trail is turned off to enable it. And if you have a cloud version of Genesis, you can contact ESHA tech support to enable the Audit Trail. If you have the installed version of Genesis, one way to enable the Audit Trail is to use the database utility, and we have instructions available for enabling the Audit Trail for the installed version, so you can email tech support if you need those instructions. So now I'll jump into Genesis and show you where to find some of these features and how to use them. You're going to hear me mention the previously recorded ingredients webinar a few times because some of these steps and concepts were covered there. So I just, again, encourage you to check out that webinar. It will be very helpful. In that, we talk more about searching and naming conventions and adding your supplier ingredients, to your software, which are the very basic steps of getting started with Genesis. So you might want to revisit that webinar for a refresher, get some of those organizational ideas down. Once you add ingredients that you need to use or get a better feel for ingredients that are already in the database, it's time to build your recipes. The main screen in Genesis looks like this, and we have our new and our open options in the software. As you save more recipes, you might be using open and opening up those existing recipes that you've already saved. But for creating a new file or a new recipe, you can go to click on new here or file, new recipe to get a new recipe started. So I'm just going to do that here, and you see the recipe information screen. You want to name your recipe a meaningful name. And again, consider the naming conventions that you or your organization need to follow so you have consistency throughout. Again, especially if multiple people will be working on one record, you want to be able to find the recipes that you save. And here again, we have the recipe makes or serving ways for your serving size options. So again, you can choose either one of these depending on what information you have, or perhaps maybe that end result label. So here I'm going to enter 36 grams as my serving size. I can also include a household measure at this point. And so that's this, a serving size is, I can select a unit from the list of units in the add measures screen here. So I'm going to say 1 slice. I'm making a bread recipe. So I'm going to say 1 slice equals 36 grams and click OK. Here you could add multiple units if you wanted to. And then again, the common name might be a shorter name that you want to assign to your recipe just for easier use or a more friendlier name. The user code is a unique code that you can assign. So if you use a coding system, again, in your organization, if it's easier to search by specific coding system, you might want to use the code, user code field. And then product and supplier. We already have a list that is populated, so you can choose from the existing list or you can add your own. And again, with ingredients, we tend to look at who is the supplier of the ingredient. So we use these product and supplier fields to track that information. For recipes, if they are your own recipes, then you may be the product and supplier, or if you have certain projects, if they're named under, if you use product and supplier with your project names, you can think about those type of naming conventions to populate those fields. I'm going to talk more about these tabs in just a few minutes, but at this point we'll continue building the recipe. So I click OK, and that takes me to my opened recipe screen where I can start adding ingredients. And again, we talked more about searching and names in the ingredients webinar. But here I can just search my database by name, by ESHA codes, by product supplier names. There are quite a few options on searching. Here I'm going to just type in flour, and I included USDA because I typically tend to use those items as far as the data that's reported. So I'm going to select this flour, and then I want to enter an amount. So I can do this again in a couple different ways. I might be working with weights. I might be working with volume measures. In this case, like I mentioned, we can work with percent. So I'm going to equate 100 grams to 100% and enter this ingredient as 35%. So you can see the units that are available for this particular flour. We have weight units, we also have some volume units. This list of available units may differ from ingredient to ingredient. Some may provide volume equivalents, others might provide units like slice or carton or something that's not a standard unit of measure. And that does depend on the supplier information. So the source of the ingredient information can provide us with the volume equivalents. So ESHA database items come pre-populated with the information that we know from our sources. As you enter your ingredients, you may have volume equivalent information that you can also add when you're entering your ingredients to your software. So again, I continue searching for ingredients. And here, if I type in water, the software will pull out water. There are certain order that search results occur in. You'll see that there's a comma, a search term, and then a comma. So the smart searching provides us with water occurring in this first section of the name. Also, as you continue to work with Genesis, the smart search idea remembers what you've used before, and it will place your more commonly used ingredients at the top of the search results list, making those easier to find. I'm going to select this water, and again, I'm working with percents. So I'll enter my amount in a percent view. Again, just continue populating your recipe with the ingredients that you need and in the amounts that you need. I'm searching by ESHA code because I do know the ESHA codes for these ingredients that I'm using. And here I have my recipe. I'm going to save because it's just a good habit. And there we go, recipe in. So you'll see here that I set my serving size as 36 grams. And as I have entered in my ingredients, the software builds, it tracks the total weight of my batch. This is one batch. It's also calculating the number of servings. So it's doing some math as I go along. If I need to change any of the ingredients here, I can certainly right-click to delete an item, or I could modify. Also, if I double-click on an ingredient, it will open that ingredient to record the modify item, so I could change the amounts, type in a new amount if I needed to make some adjustments there. And then again, here my recipe total is 100 grams, which is 100%, and that's exactly where I wanted to be. So a few other things as we're looking at the screen here. We obviously have our ingredient names, the quantity and measures that we entered. These have ESHA codes because they are all items from the ESHA database. If you have this ESHA code column displayed and don't see an ESHA code, that would indicate an item that you have added to your database. So just know how those can be differentiated. And then we have several other columns that you may or may not want to see. So honestly, I don't know what the default set of these columns is because I've changed mine around so many times. Ben's probably the same way. But you can select which of these columns you want to see. Do that by just right-clicking anywhere in the screen and then display columns. And what that will do is bring up a list of, we have these primary columns that you can choose, just check or uncheck to see or hide. I also have some nutrient columns shown because as I work with my recipe and build it, sometimes I like to see calories from each ingredient or any of these. So to make the changes to the nutrient columns, if you want to hide or select more, just click on the selected nutrients or the available to move it from one side to another. I had water chosen and now I've done away with it. So I have less columns there. A couple things that I would encourage is to use the ESHA code column and the product and supplier column, especially if you, again, good habit when you are entering your ingredients to populate the product and supplier fields, so you just have that much more information as you're building your recipe and being able to track the ingredients. Here, because I'm using ESHA database ingredients, these are all USDA items with the exception of the distilled water. But if it's a branded item, product would be known as the brand or the product line, and then the supplier would be the larger manufacturer or the supplier or source of the data. So it's just good pieces of information to keep an eye on when you're building recipes and working with ingredients. So now we'll go back to look at some of those tabs in the Edit Recipe options. I'm just going to go through these briefly to give you a bit of description. But we have, obviously, the first tab is the recipe information where you're setting your serving size or working with the common name. The next is the nutrients. And here you see several columns. This is a per serving reporting of the nutrients for your recipe. And so we have the nutrients listed, a value, quantitative value, the percent DV for those nutrients that would be showing up on your label, and then you see an override column. And so I mentioned that if you had a lab analysis, or if you knew of a certain factor that affected a particular nutrient, and you want to enter a new value in for that nutrient, you can certainly do so here in the override column. So again, nutrients tab, override column, find your nutrient, and enter a new value. So here I've adjusted my sodium by quite a bit, maybe because I sent it to the lab and I had the lab determine value. The override column was designed really for that, so you could adjust and fine-tune your recipe as you go. From here, I want to talk about the check data and the nutrient calculator while we're talking about nutrients. So check data is a useful tool to do, again, just that. Check the data that's being reported, make a few comparisons, and see if your numbers are checking out. So here again, green would be a go ahead. Your numbers check out, they fall within the tolerance that you've selected or the default 5% tolerance. So that looks okay. My fat section is showing up in red. And so again, it's calculating the total fat versus the reported total fat. Those numbers are off. So that could be due to missing values in some of my ingredients, or it could be to rounding issues. So as suppliers report data, if anything is rounded, that could affect the way these numbers add up. My proximates are adding up pretty close. Could be a rounding issue going on there. So again, back to this red, it's not stating that you're out of compliance. It just may be an indicator that you do need to check your data. One thing I could consider here for my label is that I'm not going to be reporting mono and polyunsaturated fats on my label. So I'm feeling comfortable that my total fat and my saturated and trans fats are reported as needed. So here I can choose to act on these indicators or just know that that's okay and disregard those. So again, that's the check data tool. And then the nutrient calculator would be accessed here. So the nutrient calculator, again, is a series of calculations that can be run to help populate additional nutrients based on the nutrients that I have reported for my recipe and my ingredients. And here it's telling you which nutrients could be calculated and providing the formula. So you just have that supporting information. Back to the tabs, we have the measures tab that here is showing I've set my serving size at 36 grams, so Genesis is automatically saying 1 serving equals 36 grams. And I also added that 1 slice equals 36 grams. So these are the measures that are showing up. I could add additional here, just like I showed you with the previous access to this function. The Genesis will calculate bricks for your recipes if needed. You can report cost for your recipes based on ingredient cost information. So if you populated your cost information for your ingredients, that will total. We have the groups sections. So let me show you these quickly. We populate characteristics and we divide ingredients into database collections. So you can choose to show or exclude or assign recipes to these particular groups. So here I would say my bread falls in the bread and bakery group. Compare to can be used for reports other than the label. So if you want to compare your recipe analysis to DRIs of various ages or work within Canadian labeling or US labeling, you certainly have some options there. Preparation method just gives you more fields to record the type of preparation and instructions. Reference amount is used for nutrient content claims. We have notes fields available, so you can type in anything you want. This could be used for including on reports that are sent externally, so for consumers to see or your clients to see, or it could be used internally. You just want to make sure that you dedicate it to either internal or external use. And you can change the notes titles. So I could change it from notes 1 to internal uses or something like that. Again, just be aware that whatever you change that title to is used consistently. So if it's for internal use only use that notes field for internal notes. We have HACCP instructions that give you the HACCP indicators, and then attachments. So I was talking about saving some of your files to PDF. This is where you can attach those files back to your recipe and just keep it within that recipe record. So with the attachments, you can drag and drop files here, or you can browse your computer networks and find the files that you need to store with your recipe. So from here, I want to show you what a simple label might look like based on the recipe that I've entered so far. So to do so, I'll click on View Label. And this will just bring up the default label that I have selected, which is the 2016 label. So it certainly has proper formatting, looks great, has data populated, but this is not a compliant label as is. We're missing servings per container information and serving size and the household measure. But just a note again, I was talking about attachments and saving to PDF, so this particular screen can become a report, and I could choose to print to PDF from here, and it gives you that nice label look. I need to work on my ingredient statement, and I would also need to work on my allergen statement here, but that's covered in a different webinar. But also notice here that the date is included. So again, taking a PDF of this screen, this report gives me a snapshot, that snapshot in time idea, and I can save that PDF back to my recipe. So when I'll show you just a couple steps of filling in 2 pieces of the information on the label. And again, we have full set of instructions on a different webinar and in our training sessions for working with labels. But here in the General tab under Edit Label, we have our serving size and we have our servings per container. And for serving size, I can just type in my household measure that would be required for my label. And then for servings per container, I can also type in that information. Just a note on these are text fields, so I can type in anything I want. This serving size, again, I can type in anything I want, so I want to make sure that this serving size corresponds with the gram weight that I have set, or the serving size that I have set within my recipe features. When I said a serving weighs 36 grams, I want to make sure that my 1 slice is in agreement with that 36 gram serving weight there. So you can see here the servings per container and the serving size information have populated. So again, that's the view label. And we have that nice looking label format and a potential report that we can capture. So going back to our recipe analyses, we have a few more views that we could choose. So if we take a closer look at the reports available, you can see so many different options, so many different reports, and I want to encourage you to take a look at those various report formats and see which works best for you. One might be the multi-column. I often go to that if I just want kind of that unrounded look at this per serving information. I can also choose additional columns to display on the multi-column report. So per serving, per 100 grams, a nice little snapshot of unrounded values as opposed to the rounded values on my label. But again, we always encourage you to use the spreadsheet report. And here's that view of dashes. I talked about missing values indicated by dashes on the spreadsheet report. Here I have soluble fiber and insoluble fiber shown. I'm not going to be reporting those on my label, but for these demonstration purposes, I wanted to show you some dashes on the label. And then also, it should be that sodium is in red. Ben, is sodium showing in red? Can you see? Okay. If you add an override or you enter an override, I may not have saved it in my ingredients or in my recipe, but if you assign an override value to your recipe, then that will carry forward to your spreadsheet report, and it's an indicator that, hey, this is not an original value. Keep that in mind. I have had some questions where someone is saying my label seems off. I don't know where this value is coming from. We go back to the override screen and the override column in the recipe screen and find that there has been an override value entered that that particular user wasn't aware of. That override stays, so if you change your serving size or anything like that, your override won't adjust. That override value will not adjust to other changes that you make to your recipe, so just be aware of that. If you see that red override value, you might want to take a look at the recipe screen again and make sure that everything is in line. But when we see dashes here, we want to make sure that we fill those in, and we would do that by going back to the ingredient record, opening the ingredient record, and making the changes to the ingredient. So again, it's going to pull forward to the recipe, show up as filled in on your spreadsheet, and contribute to the values reported on your label. So I'll try and do this seamlessly. So a couple ways that you could edit that ingredient. And let me talk about ingredients and edit ingredients just for a few minutes. One is pull up the ingredient. So open ingredient and search for the ingredient that you need. Which is this one. I could open this record from here. If it was an ingredient that I have added to my Genesis, then I could make any changes to any of these fields, edit anything I want. If this item, however, is an item from the ESHA database, I won't be able to change some of the fields, especially the nutrient fields. So if I needed to make changes to this ingredient, which I would like to fill in my blanks, I would need to go to File, Save As, which essentially makes a copy of the record. I do have to give it a slightly different name. And then I could make changes to that ingredient record. So edit the nutrients, fill in blanks, change the serving units, things like that. But within the ESHA database, an ESHA database item as is cannot have those fields edited. You have to make this copy. So what I could do here is fill in my blanks. Save this ingredient as its new record. What that isn't doing automatically is pulling into my recipe, so then I would need to swap out my new ingredient to my existing recipe. So if I added this to my recipe in the proper amount, and then I can swap out, remove, or delete the previous, essentially, copy of that ingredient, and then work with the new data. So again, that's 4 ESHA database items. I just want to show you that because it does come up often enough. 4 ingredients that you have added, you don't need to go through these steps here. You would just modify your copy of your ingredient and then be on your way. So we'll take a look at the spreadsheet again and just see that it's updated. with my soluble and insoluble fiber values for this ingredient. We do have a search and replace feature or function built in, but you want to do that with intention. So what it's going to do is there's a way to look for all your recipes that contain one ingredient and replace it with another. You just want to be really mindful about doing that. We've shown those steps in, I believe that was in the ingredient webinar as well. And then another thing I just wanted to mention is that here the set of nutrients to view that I have selected, I've included water in my set of nutrients. And I do that because I often work with ingredients or recipes that need adjustments. So let me show you the moisture adjustment feature in the software. That is found under the Edit Yields button. And again, we're going to talk in much more detail about this in the next webinar coming up, but I just want to go over a few points that we get common questions on. So again, this recipe is a bread. The recipe that I've entered, I've included the full amount of water as an ingredient, and so this is actually a recipe for dough. If I bake my dough, it's going to turn into bread and it's going to lose some of the moisture content. And in Genesis, we talk about water and moisture content a little interchangeably. So just know when we make a moisture adjustment, it's talking about removing some of the moisture content from the recipe itself. Whether that moisture is occurring as water, as an ingredient, or free water, or if it's the moisture that's occurring in other ingredients. Most ingredients contain some form of moisture or some amount of moisture, and we can apply that moisture adjustment to the recipe. You can work in loss or you can work in target moisture content. So depending on how you determined the adjustment of moisture or the moisture loss that occurred, you may have taken before and after weights, so dough, a portion of dough, and then that same portion as the baked form of bread, and know the difference in weights. If you can attribute that difference in weight to strictly moisture loss, then you could enter your moisture loss here. Or if you've sent finished product out to a lab and obtained lab analysis on your moisture content, you might be working towards a target moisture amount. So whatever you know to support this information that you're going to enter. In Genesis, you can enter an adjustment in terms of a percent or in an amount of weight. So again, depending on what you know, before and after weights or a target or a lab analysis, you can work within that information to enter your adjustment here. Genesis gives you a couple pieces of information. We have our original quantitative amount of moisture for the batch. My batch weight was 100 grams, so 64 grams of that is coming from moisture content. And because my batch was 100 grams, my percent happens to be the same. This is not always the case, so just be aware of those numbers. So for a quick example, if I have a 100 gram amount, a batch weight of 100 grams, my before and after weights are 20 gram difference. Then my weight difference is 20 grams or 20% weight difference. But Genesis, when it comes to percent of moisture loss, Genesis is looking for what percent of this number did you lose. So if I have a 20 gram weight difference per my 100 gram batch, that equals about 1/3 of this 64 grams of water or my water content. So rather than 20% moisture loss, I would enter 30% moisture loss because 30% or 20 grams equals 30% of my moisture content. So I just want you to be aware that Genesis speaks a little bit different language than what we typically hear when we say, I had a such and such percent moisture loss. So again, we'll cover that in a little bit more detail with some better examples or more in-depth examples. But that's what I want to show you with Genesis now. I'm going to turn it back over to Ben, and he can tell you more about the training that we offer to really dive into all of these features and more labeling issues. And we'll also have a few more points to share.
Great. Thank you so much, Alicia. That was some fantastic content. Great overview. So as Alicia mentioned, We do have our training courses available. We have actually reformatted our training courses, so I wanted to point that out. We have gone from the professional advanced training courses where it was, you're going to one or the other. We have now turned those into combo courses. So it's going to be not a 2-day course, but a 3-day course now. You can choose to do the first 2 days, which is the professional side. You can choose to do just the 3rd day, which is the advanced side, or you can do all 3. So you could take the professional and advanced trainings all at the same time. So we've adjusted that just to make it a little bit more open for anyone to be able to make it to those trainings, open up your schedule a little bit more. But we've got one coming up May 15th through 17th at our training facility in Oak Brook, Illinois. We do still have some of those specialized training courses as well. The June 19th and 20th one is going to be one of those, and that's going to be a professional training course with menu label training, so more of a restaurant styled focus or grocery styled focus. And then 2 more, July 10th through 12th and August 20th through 22nd. Both of those, or all 4 of those, are again going to be at our Oak Brook, Illinois training facility. So if you wanted to dive a little bit deeper, obviously we got through a lot of great content today, but it was only an hour, and with those trainings, you've got 2 or 3 full days of training. So expand that out even more. Go to our website if you'd like to look at that, or give us a call and we can go through the content that we go through in training and we can get you signed up for one of those. And now before we get into a few questions, we've got a couple of them. If we don't get to your question, reach out to us. I think we will, because we've kept up pretty good on them so far. But if we don't get to your question, or if it's something that you'd like to expand upon a little bit, obviously just chatting isn't quite as conversational as giving us a call. So if you want to give us a call on any of those questions, give us a call, shoot us an email either at our sales team or our support team or consulting team, depending on what you're looking for. Obviously, if you're looking for account information and sales, or questions about the software, the functions, and support. And as always, we have all those fantastic resources on our website. We have our blog, we have our newsletter, we have our e-learning center on our website, our LinkedIn page. So all of that has fantastic information as well. But getting into our questions now, and I think we've got a few that are really, really popular questions that we hear quite often. The top one we've got here: the calories on my label are not the same as when I calculate with 449. Why do I see a different value, Alicia?
Sure, yes, that is one of our top questions. So by default, and I touched on this a little bit, but I can even demonstrate a little more, Genesis reports calories for each ingredient as is. So the calories reported for your serving size in your recipe are coming from the calories reported for each ingredient. The FDA allows several different methods for determining calories. So some may be 449, some may be Atwater factors. There are various variations on those. So you'll often see that difference if you calculate 449 or calculate calories using 449 and then compare that to what Genesis is reporting, you're likely to see differences. But let me just jump back into Genesis and show you how you might handle that. So again, the Edit Recipe screen and the Nutrients tab, we talked about override. So if you used a specific method to calculate your calories, maybe you're adjusting for fiber or have sugar alcohols, you can certainly enter an override for calories. I mean, this is way different from what it's reporting, but notice that you can enter any value there. One thing you do want to, make sure that your protein, carbs, fat makes sense and fall in line with any modifications that you've made there. Another way to report for the label. So entering the nutrient override would carry forward on reports and to your label. But another way to report differently for labeling purposes is under Edit Label and the Nutrient options, calories, expand those options, and under the calorie calculation method, the default is the total of all ingredients. We also have 449 method. So that would be to change that method used to report on the label. So again, just think about if it's just on the label that you're concerned, or if you want the underlying override value to carry through on more reports. All
right, I got another question here. Can you scale recipes? for your batch information.
You can scale recipes, so there is a scale feature built in right here. So again, it's working kind of that similar recipe makes so many servings, or a recipe weighs a certain batch size. So select either of those, whichever works for you, and Genesis adjusts the recipe to fit that accordingly.
All right, our next question. Should I set my serving size to the recipe makes X number of servings, or set that to serving size equals a specific gram weight or a specific weight?
Right, again, so setting the serving size. And there it's really your preference, your determination. So there's a couple ways that, one thing that might be driving that, what we often see on brand name or brand websites, an ingredient is used in a recipe, and that brand is promoting the use of this particular ingredient. So a recipe is presented on the website for consumers to follow with instructions on preparing that recipe. So in that case, we often see a recipe that this recipe makes so many servings. So that's one way to approach recipes there. Most often when we're working with labels, we are using the RACC to determine what our target serving size should be, or, we're working with specific units, portion sizes that our manufacturing plant works with. And so most often with labeling, we would see our serving weighs a very specific amount that's driven by those to keep our labels consistent.
Not completely on topic here, but I have another question here that I'm going to go ahead and address. Can Genesis integrate with other systems like ERP systems or PLM systems? And the answer to that is yes. We have some additional tools outside of Genesis, specifically the Genesis API tool, and that will allow, generally, especially with an ERP or PLM system that's customized, allow the developer of that system to then kind of create a plugin to be able to connect Genesis in with that other system. So certainly if you'd like some additional information about integration or plugging in Genesis to another system, give our sales team a call. We can talk you through the tools that we have and work with you, your technical team, the other software that you're wanting to connect with, and work through that process. Our next question kind of getting back to recipes. How do I enter a recipe for a fried food? Definitely a very common question as well.
That is a common question, and one thing is that, simply speaking, in Genesis, you just add oil to your recipe. So, I have my recipe. If it was fried, I would just select the correct type of oil and then enter the amount that would be occurring in the finished product. So keeping in mind my serving size, I would just add the amount of oil that would occur per serving in my finished product. So that's the easy answer to the question. Determining the amount of oil that goes into your finished product is the trickier part. And that's where, if you can use any methods to determine, before and after weights for oil don't necessarily work quite as well because we have moisture loss often when we're frying foods. So that might be where you want to send product out to a lab. If you can't determine by some measurement or calculation how much oil is absorbed, you may need to send product out to a lab and get a final fat content for that.
All right, I think we have time for 2 more questions. The first one, I think Alicia might point out in the software, but I'll go ahead and answer. How do I change the %DV from US to something like Canada in the edit recipe nutrients window? And that is going to be based on the preferences. So inside of edit recipe, Alicia's pulling it open now. She clicks on nutrients. The %DV shown here is based on, as she's kind of showing you with the mouse, based on US label 2016 standards. That is changed by going to home and then preferences, and then changing under the general tab, changing your regulation. So it's not based on the label. It is separate from that. It's really the overarching software preferences of what set of regulations you want to set there. So that's the kind of the difference between that nutrients tab versus like your nutrition label, where you get those 2 settings at. And then our very last question we've got time for, how do I delete a recipe?
and you know I always say this very carefully, but again, you just want to be intentional about deleting files. With groups, you can certainly manage ingredients and recipe files to kind of put those in an archive state or version them in that form. But if you want to completely wipe it out of your software, you can go to Database up on the top ribbon and then Delete. And from here, it gives you the choices of any of the types of records, recipe, ingredient, composite ingredients, labels. You can get rid of those records there. So you just go to the section that you need, recipes. Mine pulls up my list of the recipes that I have saved in my software, or if you're working from network, you know, the list of recipes available, select any that you want and delete, and away they go. So just be intentional about that.
Definitely used a lot of discretion on deleting basically anything inside of Genesis. I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. It was a great webinar. Like I said, if we didn't get to your question, certainly give us a call or shoot us an email. We'll be able to get to you. There were certainly some really good questions there that maybe required a little bit more than just one single answer, but maybe an actual conversation. So hopefully we'll talk to you soon, and you'll join us for our next webinar. Thank you and have a great day.